It is shortly after midnight on July 25, 1943, somewhere above the North Sea, and a Royal Air Force bomb aimer is doing something that, until tonight, has been forbidden by direct order of Winston Churchill himself. He reaches into a cardboard box at his feet, pulls out a bundle of what looks like ordinary kitchen foil cut into strips, and posts it through the flare chute into the screaming dark. He does this every minute on the minute for the length of the run. Below him, in the control rooms of German night fighter stations along the coast, radar operators are staring at screens that have, in the space of a few heartbeats, gone insane. Where there should be a handful of distinct aircraft blips, there are now hundreds, thousands, a blizzard of false echoes stretching across the cathode ray tubes, indistinguishable from the real bombers hidden somewhere within them. Searchlights that should be converging with practiced precision instead sweep uselessly across empty sky. Night fighter controllers, trained for years to read the subtle signature of an incoming raid, are reduced to guesswork. Some abandon their stations entirely, convinced their equipment has failed. It has not failed. It has been beaten by a substance that costs almost nothing to produce and that any schoolchild could have folded. That night, over Hamburg, 891 Royal Air Force bombers fly through what should have been one of the most heavily defended air corridors in occupied Europe, and German losses fall to a fraction of what they had been only weeks before. This is the story of that foil, codenamed window, and of why a piece of paper-thin metal, dropped by hand from the bomb bay of a Lancaster, very nearly broke the back of Germany's air defense network in a single night. To understand why something so simple mattered so much, you have to understand what Bomber Command was facing by the summer of 1943. For 3 years, German engineers had been building, layer upon layer, one of the most sophisticated integrated air defense systems the world had ever seen. It was known to the Allies as the Kammhuber Line, named for the Luftwaffe general who had conceived it, and it stretched in a continuous belt from Denmark down through the Low Countries, a network of radar stations, searchlight batteries, anti-aircraft guns, and night fighter squadrons all woven together by radio and telephone into a single, responsive organism. At its heart sat 2 types of radar working in tandem. Freya stations, with a range of well over 100 kilometers, gave early warning of an approaching raid. Würzburg radars, shorter ranged but far more precise, then took over, locking onto individual bombers and guiding searchlights and night fighters directly onto them with a precision that had become genuinely terrifying to aircrew. Each Würzburg operator worked within his own defined box of airspace, a single cell in a vast honeycomb, and as a bomber stream passed through, it was handed from cell to cell, tracked continuously, hunted continuously. By early 1943, this system was working with brutal efficiency. Bomber Command's loss rates had crept upward to levels that, projected forward, made the entire strategic bombing campaign mathematically unsustainable. Some raids were losing 5, 6, even 8% of aircraft dispatched in a single night. With crews required to complete a tour of 30 operations, simple arithmetic meant that the average bomber crew had a worse than even chance of surviving to the end of it. Morale, inevitably, suffered. Engineers and scientists at the Telecommunications Research Establishment had understood since at least 1937 that a cloud of metal strips, cut to a length matching the wavelength of a given radar, would produce echoes so numerous and so similar to a real aircraft that they would swamp any receiver trying to make sense of them. The principle was simple, almost embarrassingly so. The problem was not technical. The problem was political, and it very nearly cost Britain the chance to use the one weapon that could have changed everything months earlier than it eventually did. The man most associated with developing the countermeasure into something operationally usable was Joan Curran, a physicist working at the Telecommunications Research Establishment in Malvern, Worcestershire, alongside her husband Samuel. It was Curran's careful experimental work through 1942 that established the precise dimensions needed. Strips of aluminium foil, roughly 27 centimeters long and 1.5 centimeters wide, calculated to resonate against the wavelength used by the Würzburg radars at around 53 centimeters. Cut any shorter or longer, and the strips would simply fail to reflect efficiently. Get the length right, and each individual strip became, to a radar set, indistinguishable from a four-engined bomber. The genius of the idea lay not in any exotic technology but in volume. A single Lancaster, dropping bundles of these strips at a steady rate, could generate on an enemy screen the apparent presence of an entire squadron. Production was almost laughably mundane. Rolls of aluminium foil backed with paper, similar in principle to ordinary kitchen foil, were cut by guillotine into the required strips at factories across Britain, then packed into bundles of around 2,000 pieces, light enough to be tossed by hand through a flare chute or, in later raids, dispensed automatically at timed intervals. Each Lancaster carried boxes amounting to several hundred kilograms of the material for a major raid, and crews were instructed to release a bundle roughly every minute, a rate calculated to maintain a continuous drifting cloud of false echoes as the bomber stream advanced. The weight of a single strip was negligible, lighter than a sheet of writing paper, yet the cumulative effect of thousands of aircraft, each dropping hundreds of bundles, was to fill the sky above the bomber stream with a phantom armada that no controller on the ground could untangle from the truth. What makes the story of Window so remarkable is not the invention itself but the year and a half of deliberate, agonized delay that preceded its use. British scientists understood by mid-1942 that German bombers, using an equivalent technique against British radar, could just as easily blind the very defenses protecting London and other cities from the Blitz. Churchill personally banned its operational deployment, fearful that revealing the principle would hand the Luftwaffe a weapon to use against Britain at a moment when the country could ill afford it. It took the mounting losses of Bomber Command through the first half of 1943, and the persuasive arguments of men like Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris and the scientist R.V. Jones to finally overturn that caution. The order to authorize Window for the looming assault on Hamburg, Operation Gomorrah, was given only weeks before the first raid, an extraordinary gamble on the calculation that the tactical benefit now outweighed the risk of German retaliation in kind. The results on the night of 24th to 25th July 1943 exceeded even the most optimistic projections. German radar operators, watching their screens fill with what one controller later described as resembling a snowstorm, found their entire ground-controlled interception system rendered almost useless within minutes. Night fighters, normally vectored with precision onto individual targets, were left circling blind, their pilots reporting dozens of contacts that dissolved the instant they closed for an attack. Searchlight batteries, which depended on radar-directed master beams to coordinate their sweeps, scattered uselessly across the sky. Bomber Command's losses for that first window-assisted raid fell to just 12 aircraft from the 891 dispatched, a loss rate of under 1.5%, compared with rates that had been running several times higher only weeks earlier over comparably defended targets. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, because the story only gets stranger from here. German engineers were not slow to respond, though their response took time to mature. Within months, the Luftwaffe had begun experimenting with adapted tactics, including a method dubbed Wild Sow, or Wild Boar, in which single-engined day fighters were directed visually onto the bomber stream, using searchlights and the glow of fires below, bypassing radar entirely. Later still came Zamsau, or Tame Boar, which abandoned the rigid box-by-box tracking of the old Kammhuber system in favor of feeding a running commentary of the bomber stream's general position to night fighters who would then locate targets using their own onboard radar sets, which Window was less effective against at close range. It is worth noting that German scientists had, in fact, understood the principle behind Window for some time before its use against Hamburg, and had likewise refrained from deploying it for fear of the very retaliation that eventually came. The parallel caution on both sides of the channel meant that for nearly 2 years, both air forces sat on a weapon neither dared to fire first. The American 8th Air Force, flying daylight raids, adopted a near-identical version of the technique under the name chaff, and to this day the term survives in NATO usage as the standard word for radar-deflecting countermeasures dropped from aircraft and ships alike. The historical impact of window is harder to pin down with precision than the dramatic figures from that first Hamburg raid might suggest. The historical impact of window is harder to pin down with precision than the dramatic figures from that first Hamburg raid might suggest. Losses on subsequent operations crept back upward as German countermeasures improved, and historians continue to debate how much of the broader Hamburg firestorm's devastation should be attributed to the disruption of the defenses versus the unusually dry summer conditions and concentrated bombing pattern that fed the resulting inferno. What is not in dispute is the psychological shock delivered to German air defense crews who had, until that night, possessed total confidence in a technologically superior system. Several post-war interrogations of Luftwaffe controllers describe a sense of helplessness and even panic as their screens filled with phantom targets, a sentiment that filtered through the chain of command and contributed to a broader crisis of confidence in the Reich's air defenses at a critical juncture in the war. Examples of the foil strips themselves survive today in the collections of the Imperial War Museum and the RAF Museum, unglamorous little artifacts, easily mistaken for nothing more than scraps of kitchen rubbish, which is rather the point. The principle Joan Curran helped refine at Malvern did not vanish with the war's end. It became, in modified form, the standard countermeasure carried by virtually every military aircraft flying today, a direct ancestor of the chaff dispensed by fighter jets to this day when threatened by radar-guided missiles. Return, for a moment, to that bomb aimer above the North Sea, posting his bundles of foil into the dark at 1-minute intervals, doing something that had been forbidden by the Prime Minister himself only weeks before. He could not have known in that moment that the silver cloud drifting behind his aircraft was unpicking, screen by screen, a defensive system that had taken the better part of a decade to build. He simply followed his orders, dropped his bundles, and flew on into a night that for once did not light up with the converging beams of 100 radar-guided searchlights. Multiply that single bomb aimer by nearly 900 aircraft, and you have a single night in which a piece of technology costing pennies per bundle achieved what years of armor plating and evasive maneuvering never could. What window proved in the end was not that German engineering was inferior. The Würzburg and Freya systems were, by any measure, formidable achievements, products of genuine technical brilliance. What window proved was that even the most sophisticated system has a single point of failure if its entire architecture depends on one method of detection, and that the simplest possible countermeasure, deployed with sufficient courage and at sufficient scale, can render years of careful engineering meaningless in the space of a single bomb run. 2 air forces understood this weapon. 2 air forces feared it. Only one, in the end, decided that the moment for caution had passed and dropped the foil. The skies over Hamburg, on that night in July 1943, tell you everything you need to know about which decision proved right.